My name is Edward. I'm 43, and for the last 14 years I've worked as a forensic accountant for a regional bank, which means I get paid to find the exact moment someone's financial story stops matching reality. I was standing in my driveway on a Wednesday evening in November, holding my phone, reading a text message from a man I'd never met, when I realized I already knew everything he was about to tell me, and that knowing it first was about to matter more than I expected. The message read, "This is Daniel Cho. I think you and I need to talk. I haven't been able to sleep, and I don't think I can keep doing this anymore. Your wife and I have been seeing each other for a while now. I'm sorry. I just couldn't keep carrying this alone." I read it twice, standing under the motion sensor light that had clicked on when I pulled into the driveway, my car still running behind me. There was a third read where I noticed something the first two reads had missed. Not the confession itself, but the tone underneath it. He wasn't telling me something. He was unburdening himself of something. And those are not the same act, even when the words look identical on a screen. I had a folder in my home office, locked in the bottom drawer of my desk, containing 11 months of hotel receipts, credit card statements, and a private investigator's report that documented everything Daniel Cho had just confessed to me, in far greater detail than his 3 rushed sentences. He didn't know that. He thought he was the one breaking the news. I typed back a single word, "Okay," and nothing else, because I needed time to decide what kind of conversation this was actually going to be before I had it. But to understand why a stranger's guilty conscience landed on me like old information instead of a thunderclap, I have to go back almost a year, to a Sunday afternoon in our kitchen, back when I still believed the biggest threat to my marriage was how little time my wife and I had for each other, rather than how much time she'd found for someone else. Renata and I had been married for 16 years by that November, and for most of them, I would have told you, without hesitation, that I knew exactly who I'd married. She worked as a hospital administrator, the kind of job that required her to be calm under pressure, organized to a fault, and almost pathologically good at managing other people's crises while keeping her own carefully out of view. I admired that about her for years before I understood it was also the exact skill set that would let her manage a secret for the better part of a year without my noticing the seams. We met in our late 20s at a mutual friend's wedding, and what drew me to her initially wasn't anything dramatic. It was how completely unbothered she seemed by things that rattled most people. A delayed flight, a canceled reservation, a difficult relative at a holiday dinner. Renata absorbed disruption the way some people absorb sunlight, without visible strain, and for years I found that quality steadying in a way I didn't examine too closely. I trusted too long past the point where trust was still rational, and I think now that one reason I did was because her composure made it almost impossible to read when something had actually changed underneath it. We had no children, a decision we'd made together early in the marriage, after some difficult years of trying that neither of us liked discussing in detail, and which had, over time, become simply a fact of our life rather than an open wound. Our marriage, by the time Renata turned 40, had settled into something comfortable and a little quiet. Not unhappy, exactly, but running at a lower temperature than it had in our 30s, the way most long marriages eventually do, for reasons that are usually nobody's fault in particular. There's one scene from the years before any of this that I keep returning to, because it explains something about why the eventual loss mattered as much as it did. We'd taken a trip to Lisbon for our 10th anniversary, and on the third night, we got lost trying to find a restaurant a friend had recommended, ended up in completely the wrong neighborhood, and finally gave up and ate at a tiny place with 4 tables and no English menu. Renata ordered for both of us using a combination of pointing and badly mispronounced Portuguese, and the owner, charmed despite himself, brought out dish after dish we hadn't asked for on the house, until we were both laughing too hard to keep eating. I remember watching her across that small table, completely delighted, completely present, and thinking that whatever else happened in our life, I wanted to keep finding my way back to evenings like that one. I married that version of her. For a long time, I believed that version was who she actually was beneath the composure, and that the calm, managed surface she showed the rest of the world was simply the armor she needed for a demanding job, not a wall she'd also built, gradually, between the two of us. I worked long hours, the kind my field tends to demand. Audits don't respect dinner reservations, and fraud investigations have a way of expanding to fill whatever time you give them. I told myself, The way I suspect most people in demanding careers tell themselves that the hours were temporary, that things would ease once a particular case closed, once a particular quarter ended. They rarely did. Renata never complained about it directly, which I mistook, for years, as evidence that it didn't bother her, rather than evidence that she'd simply found other places to put whatever it stirred up in her. The first thing that didn't quite fit arrived in March, almost a year before that text message in my driveway. A calendar notification on the shared family app we used for scheduling, listing a department retreat for hospital administrators that ran Thursday through Saturday, in a city neither of us had any particular connection to. I didn't think much of it at the time. Hospital administration involves more conferences and retreats than most people realize, and Renata had attended dozens over the years without my ever questioning the pattern. I asked her about it over dinner, mostly out of idle curiosity rather than suspicion. "Where's this retreat again?" "Asheville," she said, not looking up from the salad she was assembling. "Some leadership development thing. Half the senior admin team is going. It's mandatory, basically, even though they call it optional." "Sounds tedious." "You have no idea," she said. And we moved on to talking about something else entirely, and I didn't think about it again until much later, when I went looking for exactly this conversation in my memory and found it strangely hard to recall the specifics, the way you struggle to recall a sentence you weren't really listening to the first time you heard it. Looking back, that was the first sign. I just didn't have a file open on it yet, and at the time, there was no reason I would have thought to open one. The pattern, once it actually started accumulating, did so in increments small enough that no single one of them would have justified suspicion on its own. That's the part people who haven't lived through it tend to underestimate. Betrayal rarely announces itself as a single dramatic break. It arrives as a slow accumulation of plausible explanations, each one reasonable in isolation, until one day you look back and realize you've been accepting a version of reality that, examined as a whole, no longer holds together. The Asheville retreat in March was followed by a credentialing conference in May, a vendor negotiation summit in July, and a regional administrator symposium in September. 4 trips in 7 months, each with its own bureaucratic-sounding name, each lasting 2 to 3 nights, each one individually unremarkable for a woman in her position. I noted the frequency the way I note anomalies in a fraud case, not yet as evidence of anything, just as a data point that would eventually need reconciling against something else, if it ever became necessary to reconcile it at all. What I didn't notice, because I wasn't yet looking for it, was a more specific pattern underneath the trips themselves. Renata's phone, which had always lived openly on the kitchen counter or the nightstand, face up, the way you leave a phone when you have nothing in particular to hide, started living face down sometime around the May conference. A small adjustment. The kind of thing that means nothing to anyone except someone trained to notice when a habit changes shape without explanation. I am a man who reads inconsistency for a living. I had spent 14 years getting paid to flag exactly this kind of pattern in other people's financial behavior, and somehow it took me the better part of that entire year to apply the same scrutiny to my own household. In June, I noticed Renata had started taking calls in the guest bathroom, the one at the far end of the hallway, the one we almost never used, with the door closed and the exhaust fan running, which struck me, when I finally thought about it consciously, as an odd combination. The fan wasn't for privacy from sound. It was for privacy from inference, the kind of detail that only makes sense once you already suspect something, and means nothing at all if you don't. She told me, much later, what those calls actually were. This is what she said. Daniel called most evenings around 7, after his own wife had put their kids to bed. I told myself the bathroom was just easier, fewer interruptions, no chance of Edward walking past, and catching half a sentence out of context. I didn't think of it as hiding, not at first. I thought of it as keeping 2 separate parts of my life from accidentally touching each other, the way you keep raw chicken away from vegetables on a cutting board. It took me months to admit that the reason I needed 2 separate parts at all was the actual problem, not the bathroom door. I'm back with Edward now, the same summer, the version of him that still thought the fan was just a fan. I asked Renata, once, in July, why she'd started closing the bathroom door for phone calls. She said something about wanting quiet, about the kitchen being too loud with the television on, and I accepted it the way I'd accepted the retreat explanation in March. Not because it was airtight, but because questioning it felt disproportionate to the evidence. And I had built, over 16 years, a habit of giving Renata the same professional courtesy I extended trusted colleagues, rather than the scrutiny I reserved for actual cases. The real crack in my certainty came in August, not from anything Renata said or did, but from something she stopped doing. She'd always had a habit, going back to our earliest years together, of texting me a photo of whatever she was eating for lunch when she was traveling. A small, silly ritual neither of us had ever discussed explicitly, just something that had accumulated into a kind of language between us. Sometime around the July conference, without my consciously registering when, the photos stopped. I noticed the absence in September, scrolling back through old messages looking for a restaurant recommendation she'd sent me months earlier, and finding that the last lunch photo was dated in June. I called it her being busier than usual, in my head, for about 2 weeks. I wouldn't call it that anymore, not once the rest of it started arriving. I want to be honest about what I did next, because it set the tone for everything that followed. I didn't confront Renata in September when the missing lunch photos first registered as strange. I started, almost without consciously deciding to, doing what I do professionally. I began building a file. I requested 2 years of our joint credit card statements under the cover of reorganizing our finances for an upcoming refinance, which Renata accepted without suspicion since I genuinely did handle most of our household financial administration and had done so for years without it ever being remarkable. I cross-referenced the 4 conference trips against the statements, looking for charges that didn't match the stated itineraries: a coffee shop in the wrong part of a city, a parking garage near an address that had nothing to do with any hospital administrator's symposium. I found 3 discrepancies across the 4 trips. Small charges, easily explained individually, but consistent in their location. All 3 clustered within a few blocks of an address that, when I searched it, turned out to belong to a boutique hotel I'd never heard either of us mention. I am a man who reads inconsistency for a living. I had spent 14 years getting paid specifically to notice exactly this kind of pattern in other people's financial behavior, and it had taken me the better part of a year to apply that same scrutiny to my own household, mostly because applying it meant admitting I needed to. I hadn't put together the full shape of it yet, but the part of me trained to read ledgers for a living already had, and it was no longer willing to be talked back down by the explanations I kept quietly offering myself on its behalf. I hired a private investigator in early October, a careful, unhurried man named Frank Delario who'd done occasional work for the bank's internal fraud division and who I trusted to be discreet without being dramatic about it. I gave him the boutique hotel, the dates of the upcoming symposium Renata had already mentioned for the following month, and asked him to simply document, without intervening, whatever he found. He came back 10 days later with more than I'd asked for. Photographs of Renata's car in the hotel's small parking structure, time-stamped across 2 of the days she'd told me she was attending sessions. A man, mid-40s, arriving separately, entering the same building 20 minutes after her. Frank had run the plate on his car as a standard part of his process, a rental, registered to a corporate account, the kind of paper trail that exists specifically so individual renters don't show up as the primary name attached to a vehicle. It took Frank another 4 days to identify the man through the rental agreement's corporate account, which traced back to a medical device distribution company. Daniel Cho, a sales director who worked the same regional hospital circuit Renata's job required her to navigate constantly. Vendors, equipment negotiations, the unglamorous machinery that keeps a hospital administrator's calendar full of names that mean nothing to anyone outside the industry. I looked at his photograph for longer than I needed to. He had an unremarkable, approachable face, not someone I could resent cleanly as a caricature of a homewrecker, which somehow made the whole thing feel more disorienting rather than less. Just a man in a gray sport coat who happened to be standing in the wrong parking structure at the wrong time, captured by a camera he had no idea existed. I sat in my car outside Frank's office for almost 20 minutes before I drove home that day. I already knew, intellectually, what I was holding. I just hadn't let myself feel the full weight of it yet, the way you can understand a diagnosis without having absorbed it. I want to tell you what I did with that information over the following weeks, because it says something about who I am that I'm still sitting with, even now. I didn't confront Renata. I kept making coffee in the mornings, the same 2 cups, mine black, hers with the specific amount of cream she'd taken for 16 years. I drove to work. I closed 2 unrelated fraud cases for the bank with the same methodical patience I was supposedly applying to my own life, and told myself the patience was strategy rather than avoidance. The truth is closer to this. Some part of me understood that the moment I said any of it out loud, the marriage would end, formally and irreversibly, and I wasn't ready to be the one who ended it, even with a folder full of photographs and a name, Daniel Cho, that I now couldn't stop turning over in my mind every time the house went quiet. I had confused gathering proof with avoiding the conversation the proof demanded. Those are not the same instinct, even though for weeks I told myself they were. By the end of October, Frank's file had grown to include 11 months of pattern, not just the 4 conferences, but a broader rhythm of smaller, local meetings he'd identified once he knew what to look for. A coffee shop 2 towns over, visited on a recurring basis that didn't correspond to anything on Renata's work calendar. A parking structure downtown, visited on Tuesday evenings when Renata had told me she was at a department dinner. 11 months. Not the 4 trips I'd initially suspected. The relationship, as far as Frank could reconstruct it, appeared to have started the previous December, almost a full year before that text message would eventually arrive in my driveway. Earlier than any single piece of evidence I'd found on my own, earlier than I'd let myself imagine when I started the file. That detail rearranged something in how I understood the whole shape of it. I had been building my picture of the affair around the conferences, the trips with their bureaucratic names, treating them as the architecture of the deception. The real architecture was smaller and closer to home than that. A coffee shop 2 towns over, a Tuesday evening parking structure, ordinary places that had nothing to do with travel at all, sustained quietly underneath the more dramatic trips I'd been focused on the whole time. I gave Renata one chance before I did anything else with what Frank had found, and I want to be precise about why, because it matters to everything that happened afterward. Some part of me, the part that had spent 14 years extending people the benefit of the doubt right up until the moment the numbers made doubt impossible, needed to know whether she would tell me herself, unprompted, if I simply created room for her to do it. I waited until a Sunday afternoon in early November, the 2 of us alone in the kitchen, no particular occasion, and asked her, as plainly as I could manage, whether there was anything she wanted to tell me about the past year. She looked up from the coffee she was making, and I watched her face do the specific thing faces do when a person is deciding, in real time, whether to lie. A small pause. A flicker of calculation behind otherwise composed features. The same composure I'd once found so steadying, now revealing itself as something closer to a trained reflex for managing crisis without visible strain. "What kind of thing?" she said. "Any kind of thing, Renata. I'm not going to lead you to it. I'm asking you directly." She set the coffee pot down carefully, which told me, more than anything she eventually said, that she was using the motion to buy herself time to decide which version of the next few minutes she wanted to live inside. "Things have felt distant between us for a while," she said. "I don't know if that's the kind of thing you mean." "It's not," I said. "I know about Daniel Cho. I know about the hotel near the symposium. I know about the coffee shop and the parking structure on Tuesdays. I've known the broad shape of it for weeks." I watched something leave her face when I said his name, not surprise exactly. Something closer to the specific exhaustion of a person who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just been told they no longer have to pretend they aren't carrying it. She asked how I'd found out. Not whether it was true. How I'd found out. That answered the larger question before she ever answered it directly, the way it always does. "It started last December," she said, sitting down across from me at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't actually poured anything into. "There was a vendor negotiation that ran long, and Daniel and I ended up talking afterward, just talking, for almost 2 hours. I hadn't had a conversation like that with anyone in years. It wasn't about you, not at first. It became about something else slowly enough that I'm not sure I can point to the exact day it stopped being innocent." "Why him specifically?" I asked, because I'd promised myself I'd only need one real question, and the facts alone couldn't answer this part of it. She was quiet for a long moment. "He made me feel like the version of myself I used to be before this job turned me into someone who manages other people's emergencies for a living and has nothing left over for my own. I know that's not an excuse. It's just the truest thing I can tell you. I sat with that answer longer than I sat with any of Frank's photographs. There's a kind of honesty that's almost worse than a clean confession because it doesn't give you anywhere to direct your anger. It just leaves you holding the genuine, complicated truth of another person's loneliness, which turns out to be a much heavier thing to hold than a simple lie would have been. I think I need some time to think, I told her, and I drove to a hotel that night. Not the same one in Frank's photographs, a different one entirely, with bad carpeting and a view of a parking lot. And I sat there understanding, finally and completely, that whatever hope I'd been quietly nursing through Frank's entire investigation had just been spent. What happened over the following 2 weeks is the part of this story I still find strange to tell, because it didn't unfold the way I expected betrayal stories to unfold. I didn't file anything immediately. I didn't tell anyone. Renata and I existed in a careful, unresolved suspension, not living as a married couple exactly, but not yet living as two people who had decided to stop being one, either. We talked, haltingly, about what came next. I told her I needed time before either of us made anything official. She agreed, and for 2 weeks, the house held a strange, brittle quiet that neither of us seemed to know how to break. I assumed, during those 2 weeks, that Daniel Cho was simply a fact that existed somewhere outside our house. A name in Frank's file, a face in a photograph, someone whose own life and own choices had nothing further to do with mine beyond what had already happened. I had no idea he was sitting somewhere in his own house, with his own guilt accumulating into something he could no longer carry quietly, building toward a decision that would land in my driveway on a Wednesday evening in a way I hadn't anticipated at all. She told me much later what those 2 weeks looked like from Daniel's side. Once enough had come out that the full picture finally made sense to her too. This is what she pieced together and told me. Daniel called me crying on a Tuesday night, near the end of those 2 weeks, and told me he couldn't keep doing this. Not us, specifically, but the secrecy itself. He said his wife had asked him, out of nowhere, why he'd been so distant, and he hadn't been able to answer her honestly. And something about that question had broken something open in him that he couldn't close back up. I told him to wait. I told him I was already handling things on my end, that Edward and I were talking, that there was no need for him to do anything dramatic. He said he understood. I believed him. I think he believed himself, too, right up until he didn't anymore. I'm back in our brittle, quiet house now. The same 2 weeks, the version of me that thought the worst of it was already behind us. The text arrived on a Wednesday evening, while I was pulling into the driveway after a long day closing out an unrelated case at the bank. I've already told you what it said. I've already told you what I did with it. One word, okay, and then nothing, while I stood under the motion sensor light deciding what kind of conversation this was actually about to become. What I hadn't told you yet is what I did in the hour immediately after, because that hour is where I finally understood the real shape of what had just happened, and it had almost nothing to do with the affair itself. I called Renata, who was inside the house, unaware that her lover had just texted her husband directly. I asked her to come outside, into the driveway, without explaining why. When she did, I showed her the message on my phone, watching her face for the second time in 2 weeks do the thing it does when she's processing something she didn't see coming. This time, there was no calculation in her expression, just genuine, unguarded shock. The specific look of someone realizing that a situation they thought they still had some control over has just been taken entirely out of their hands by someone else's decision. He texted you, she said. Directly? He thinks he's telling me something I don't already know. Edward, I told him not to do anything. I told him I was handling it. I believe you, I said, and I meant it, which surprised me even as I said it. But that's not actually the part I'm thinking about right now. She looked at me, confused, standing in the cold driveway in just a sweater, and I realized, looking at her, that I finally understood something about the entire 11 months that I hadn't understood through any of Frank's photographs or any of our own kitchen table conversations. Renata had spent nearly a year managing 2 separate relationships with the same careful, practiced composure she brought to crises at the hospital, keeping Daniel calm, keeping me unsuspecting, keeping her own guilt compartmentalized into a bathroom with the fan running. She had been good at it. Genuinely, professionally good at it. The way she was good at everything requiring calm management of other people's emotional weather. What she hadn't accounted for. What neither of us had accounted for. was that Daniel wasn't actually as contained as she believed. His guilt had its own momentum, separate from her management of it, and that momentum had just driven him to do something neither of us controlled. Tell the truth to the one person whose reaction he had no way of predicting, because he didn't know that person had already spent 11 months quietly building a complete account of everything he was now confessing. I want to be precise about the layer this added to everything, because it's the part of the story I think about more than the affair itself, even now. The betrayal wasn't singular. It was doubled, in a strange way. First Renata's, sustained for 11 months with real skill and real care taken to protect me from exactly this moment. And then Daniel's, arriving not as an extension of her plan, but as a rupture of it, driven by a guilt that belonged entirely to him, and that neither Renata nor I had any way to manage once it decided to move on its own. I understood, standing in that driveway, that I had spent weeks assuming I held all the power in this situation, because I held all the documentation. Frank's file, the photographs, the months of receipts. I'd built an advantage out of knowing before anyone else that I knew. And then a man I'd never met, acting entirely outside my control, had reminded me that knowledge isn't actually the same thing as control, and that other people's consciences operate on their own timeline regardless of how carefully you've built your case. We went back inside. Renata texted Daniel something I didn't ask to see, and whatever she said, he didn't text either of us again. I never spoke to him directly, not once, in all the weeks that followed. I never wanted to. Whatever guilt had driven him to reach out to me directly was his to carry, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I had very little curiosity left about the specifics of his inner life. He was a name in a file. He'd briefly become a complication standing in my driveway. By December, he was simply someone Renata had once been involved with, increasingly irrelevant to whatever came next between the two of us. What came next, over the following month, was a slower, quieter unraveling than I expected. Renata and I didn't divorce immediately. That decision, when it finally came, arrived in January, almost 2 months after the text message, following a series of careful, exhausting conversations that covered everything Frank's file hadn't. Why she'd started feeling invisible years before Daniel ever entered the picture. Why I'd spent so long building a case instead of simply asking her directly what was happening. Why both of us, in our different ways, had been managing the marriage instead of actually living inside it. I asked her, in one of those January conversations, whether she would have told me eventually, on her own, without Daniel's intervention forcing the timeline. She was quiet for a long time before she answered. I want to say yes, she finally said, but I don't actually know. I think I might have just kept managing it indefinitely, the way I manage everything else, if he hadn't broken first. I believed her. I think that answer, more than anything else she said during those weeks, told me something true about both of us. That we'd built a marriage, over 16 years, that ran almost entirely on careful management rather than honest confrontation, and that it had taken someone outside the marriage entirely, acting on his own guilty conscience, to finally force the confrontation neither of us had been able to generate on our own. The divorce was finalized that spring. There was no dramatic final scene, no scene like the one I'd half expected when I first opened Frank's file back in October. No raised voices, no thrown objects, just a quiet, methodical dismantling of 16 years into separate apartments, separate accounts, separate Sundays. I moved into a place close enough to my old life that I still recognized the grocery store, the dry cleaner, the route to work, but far enough that the house itself stopped being something I drove past by accident. I think about Daniel Cho sometimes, though less often than I expected to. I don't know what happened to his own marriage, whether his confession to his wife followed the same path his confession to me did, whether his guilt found the same resolution mine eventually did, or a different one entirely. I never asked Renata, and at some point, I stopped wanting to know. What I learned, in the end, wasn't really about Renata's affair, or even about the strange doubling of betrayal that Daniel's text introduced into the story. It was about the limits of the specific skill I'd built an entire career on. I had spent 14 years believing that if I could just gather enough documentation, enough proof, enough certainty before acting, I could control the shape and timing of difficult truths. Daniel's text taught me, more clearly than anything else in this entire story, that other people's consciences don't wait for your timeline. no matter how complete your file is. Sometimes the truth arrives on someone else's schedule entirely, and all your careful preparation only determines how surprised you are when it does. I spent months looking for the single moment our marriage actually broke. I finally understood there wasn't one. Not Daniel, not the December conversation that started it, not even the 11 months of careful management that followed. It had been a slow drift, the kind that doesn't register until someone outside the drift forces you to look at the whole distance traveled at once. The house looked fine from the outside for almost a year. That's the part that took longest to make peace with. Not that Renata had lied, but that I'd had a file complete enough to prove it for weeks before I let myself feel the weight of what it actually meant. The most painful detail in this story isn't the 11 months, the hotel near the symposium, or even the coffee shop 2 towns over that Edward eventually traced with the same patience he'd bring to any fraud case. It's the moment Daniel Cho's text arrives in the driveway, not because it reveals anything Edward doesn't already know, but because it reveals how little control his careful documentation actually gave him over the timing and shape of his own life. He had spent weeks building an advantage out of knowing first. A stranger's guilty conscience reminded him that knowing first isn't the same as controlling what happens next. There's a temptation to read Daniel simply as a coward seeking absolution at Edward's expense, using a confession to unburden himself without any consideration for the damage it might cause. The story complicates that reading without excusing it. Daniel's guilt, by every account that surfaces later, was genuine and had its own momentum entirely separate from Renata's careful management of the affair. He wasn't trying to hurt Edward or expose Renata strategically. He was drowning in something he could no longer carry alone, and he reached for the nearest available relief, which happened to be the one person whose reaction he had the least ability to predict. That doesn't make the text kind. It makes it human in a way that's harder to simply condemn than a more calculated betrayal would have been. What's striking is how precisely the structure of the affair mirrors the structure of Edward's own response to discovering it. Renata managed 2 relationships with practiced, professional composure for 11 months, compartmentalizing her guilt the way she compartmentalized every other crisis in her professional life. Edward, once he suspected something was wrong, managed his own response with the same careful compartmentalization, building a file, gathering proof, delaying the conversation the proof demanded for weeks because confronting it directly felt disproportionate to manage all at once. Both of them, in their own registers, substituted careful management for honest confrontation, right up until Daniel's unmanaged guilt forced a reckoning neither of them had been able to generate on their own. This is where the story's real subject comes into focus. It isn't really about an affair exposed through a guilty lover's text. It's about what happens when an entire marriage runs on management rather than honesty for long enough that even its ending requires outside intervention to actually happen. Edward's skill at reading inconsistency, the very thing that let him build a complete picture of the betrayal, also became the thing that let him delay acting on it for weeks. Proof, gathered carefully enough, can become its own form of avoidance, a way of feeling productive while still not doing the harder thing the proof demands. There's something worth sitting with, too, in how the story treats the idea of who gets to control a confession. Renata spent 11 months controlling the narrative of her own affair with real skill. Edward spent weeks believing his documentation gave him control over how and when the truth would finally surface. Both of them were wrong, in the end, about who actually held that control. It belonged, in the final accounting, to a man neither of them had fully reckoned with as an independent variable, acting on a guilty conscience that followed its own timeline entirely. If this story reached you, it's probably because some part of it felt familiar, not necessarily the affair or the driveway text, but the quieter recognition of how much of any relationship runs on careful management instead of honest confrontation, and how often it takes something entirely outside your control to finally force the reckoning you'd been delaying on your own. The question this story leaves you with isn't who betrayed whom first. It's simpler and harder than that. In your own life, how much of what you call patience is actually just a more sophisticated form of avoidance? And what would it take for you to stop waiting for someone else's conscience to do the work yours hasn't done yet?